is the other person here. I can see him on my little thumbnail window. I don't know if you can, but Philipp will be handling questions together with me at the end. What our intention is for me to do a relatively brief presentation for about 20 minutes. And then we open the floor to everyone to ask questions. Now, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat, and Philipp and I will monitor that and then get to the questions at the end. But you can post them in the chat anytime, although I will, of course, try not to be distracted by that while I talk. So, well, and I want to talk to you about the infodemic and vaccine hesitancy. These are all sort of buzzwords that have been in the media quite a bit as a result of COVID. And even the World Health Organization about a year ago already, I think, warned of this infodemic that was accompanying the pandemic, the actual virus. Now, to some extent, that is not surprising. For me, as a cognitive scientist, it is not surprising at all, because throughout history, whenever there's been a pandemic, there have been conspiracy theories. Back in the 14th century, that expressed itself as anti-Semitism. In Russia in 1892, people blamed doctors for a cholera epidemic and chased anyone in a white coat down the street. Now, you may think, oh, well, that was Russia, far away in time and space. Well, think again. Just a few months ago in Holland, which is closer in space, and a few months ago, very close in time, rioters attacked a hospital in their frustration over the pandemic. So this happens because people are insecure, people feel that they've lost control, and whenever people feel a loss of control, then a certain proportion of them will resort to conspiracy theories. And in the United Kingdom, the estimates differ, but around 10% of the British public thinks that COVID-19 is a Chinese bioweapon for which there's no evidence. And they may also think at the same time that it is a hoax. Two things that are actually quite incompatible, but nonetheless, people sometimes have contradictory beliefs. Now, that's problematic because there is now quite a bit of evidence to suggest that greater endorsement of COVID-19 conspiracies is linked to less adherence of social distancing measures and also reduced willingness to be vaccinated. And moreover, about a year ago, 10 months ago, there was a particular conspiracy theory going around the place, namely the belief that 5G broadband has something to do with COVID. It doesn't. But nonetheless, some people believe that, and they set installations on fire. It's a really smart thing to do, because if you want to call an ambulance because you have COVID, well, you can't get through because somebody burned down the cell phone tower. So these conspiracy theories have consequences. And it turns out that coincidentally, at about the time the pandemic started, together with colleagues, I wrote a little handbook about conspiracy theories, and I'm going to put the link to that in the chat just in case you want to download it later. It's available in 8 or 9 languages by now. That explains some of the things that I've already talked about. Now, as a soundbite, just to wrap that up, some people fall prey to conspiracy theories whenever they suffer a loss of control. And that has been stimulated or triggered by pandemics throughout the centuries. We know that that is one of the consequences to expect. Now, it goes further than that, because misinformation matters even if it is not packaged as a full-blown conspiracy theory. Misinformation affects people's behavior. Now, we're beginning to detect evidence that this is a causal relationship. In other words, that if you are exposed to misinformation, then it is that exposure and nothing else. No other confounding variable or correlated thing or all the other sort of things we worry about in science. It is the misinformation that changes your behavior and attitudes. We know that exposure to misinformation, at least temporarily, reduces people's intent to get vaccinated. And in the United States, you can trace which TV station people watch to their compliance with social distancing measures. And we find that there is a detrimental effect of watching one particular TV station that has consistently downplayed the pandemic. So misinformation matters. And it is for that reason that a team of international authors wrote a second handbook last year. It came out in October, and Philipp is one of the authors on this one as well. And I put the link in the chat because this is a general resource about how to deal with misinformation. And because this festival is about celebrating international collaboration, I thought, I'll show all the authors to convince you that, yes, really, that was a global effort. Europe, the US, and Australia, among other places. Now, what does it say in that handbook? I can't go through the whole thing, but I can make two major points. The first point is that misinformation sticks. What does that mean? That means if people are exposed to something like, the Pope endorsed Donald Trump, complete nonsense, even after they encounter a correction and believe it, people still sometimes rely on the misinformation. This is pernicious, and it is known as the continued influence effect. And what happens is that as people go through the world, all of us, we encounter information and we use that information to build a mental model of the world around us. We call that a mental model, a mental representation of what's happening in the world. And we put all these elements together like a Lego building. And then if somebody all of a sudden tells us an important element of that is false, well, what are you going to do? It's very hard to rip out a central element of a mental representation and not replace it with something. There's a hole in your head, so to speak, symbolically. And it turns out that it's extremely difficult for people to cope with that. So what they then do is that they will say, on the one hand, yes, you told me that that was false. The Pope did not endorse Donald Trump. However, outside the context of that specific question, they will still act as if they rely on that misinformation. So they will still say something about how the Pope loves Donald Trump in a different context, even though they've just told you they know that's false. And we observe this all the time. People tell us, oh, that's wrong. I know that, you told me. But then they act as though they still believe it. So that's the first point we have to understand. And it says that in the debunking handbook, you can read, there's a lot of literature on this out there. So what do we do? How can we cope? How do we respond to that? Well, it turns out there's a lot of things we can do. One of the most available tools that I like a lot is called inoculation. And inoculation is just like a medical vaccination, except it is cognitive. What we do is we warn people that they're about to be misinformed or may be misinformed. And we then accompany that warning with a refutation of how they will be misled, okay? So what that means is I have to know ahead of time how people will be misinformed. But I don't have to know ahead of time what exactly it is that is going to be said to mislead people. So what we do, the clever thing for me that I like about inoculation is that we're not talking about specific contents. We're talking about the strategies that are being used to mislead people. And just to illustrate what I mean by that is, here's a paper by colleagues of ours at Cambridge, who have a paper coming out where they inoculated the public against COVID-19 misinformation. How? Well, they showed people these little infographics that you can see on the screen right now. And what these little infographics do is to explain how you can spot conspiracy theory. They talk about red flags. What are the red flags? What are the 6 things that conspiracy theories have in common? Yeah, just alerting people to what they might see, and so they can then be on the lookout for this misinformation. Now, in one condition in this experiment I'm telling you about, people were exposed to these infographics. In another condition, they played a video game, Tetris, that has nothing to do with misinformation. That's just a control condition for comparison. After that, after the inoculation treatment, people were exposed to 2 types of tweets, pseudo tweets that we presented to them, but they're very realistic sounding. Half of them were manipulative. The other half was accurate at the time of writing. And then we measure people's discernment, that is their ability to differentiate between being manipulated and being informed. And we find that in the inoculation condition, people get better at it. So by, in this instance, just showing them these infographics, people get better at resisting misinformation. We've done this many times over now with videos, brief videos instead of infographics. We've done it even with games, little iPhone type apps where you play a game learning how to resist misinformation. And by and large, across a broad range of arenas, that works. Now, that was sort of a little bit more general background. I'm now returning to COVID and the infodemic, and a third project that we completed last year. And again, if you look at the list of authors, Philipp is there again. He is part of the second handbook that we published last year, specifically about COVID-19 vaccine communication and how to deal with vaccine hesitancy. So what I now want to do is tell you a little bit about what's in the handbook and what comes with it. Now, to put that into context, I'm going to re-emphasize and reinforce what I already said, and that is that there is an infodemic that comes with the COVID pandemic. What I haven't told you yet, but what is important to keep in mind, is that at the same time, that has been accompanied by an increase in trust in scientists. The 2 things go together. And that's, I think, very important to recognize, because it tells us a little about how we should communicate. Now, here are data from the UK. I could show you the similar data, very similar data for Germany and you know, even in the US, I've seen data like that, that as a consequence of the pandemic, or at least at the time when the pandemic kicked in, the public expressed greater trust and reliance on scientists and researchers than before. 2/3 of the British public indicated that because of the pandemic, they're now more likely to listen to expert advice. So what really happens with the infodemic is that it creates a split between people on the one hand who trust experts more, but on the other hand, some people who go into conspiracy theories because of this fear of loss of control of their lives that I mentioned at the outset. Now, here's some more recent data about vaccine attitudes across Europe and various different countries. And what you can see is that across Europe and including the UK, there's actually been a considerable increase in people's positive feelings towards vaccines. In the UK, it's been an increment of 20 percentage points between November and January of this year. Now, the pattern is a lot more complicated now because of all the side effects issue surrounding the AstraZeneca vaccine, which interestingly has not, or seemingly has not, changed overall attitudes towards vaccinations in Europe. Although there is some evidence from Denmark that I saw just a few days ago suggesting that there is a selective distrust of that particular vaccine, which is perhaps not altogether surprising. But what is gratifying is that that hasn't affected all the other vaccines that are out there. So that's the sort of positive background that we also have to acknowledge, in addition to the infodemic, that actually, by and large, people trust scientists, trust experts, and are very much in favor of vaccinations. Back to our handbook, which of course, I put the link in the chat, you can download that. That has specific advice about how to communicate and tells you a little bit about how you can deal with vaccine hesitancy. And in brief, the answer is similar to what I've already given you. You can inoculate people against it successfully. And there's a number of other techniques that are in the handbook. What the handbook also does is that it is a living document. It isn't just a PDF that you can wave. I don't know how you wave an electronic document, but you can sort of a PDF that you look at statically, but within it, there are buttons that are taking you through to an underlying wiki, a collection of 22 pages that are constantly being updated. In fact, we had one update yesterday, which I will tweet out tonight after our meeting here. And in fact, what I'm going to tweet about is one of the pages I just wanted to highlight now, which I call organized denial, and which really refers to the politics of COVID-19 misinformation and vaccinations generally. Because like everything else, misinformation has been politicized. Misinformation about COVID, in particular in the United States, is terribly polarized. The UK is not that bad. However, we have politically motivated misinformation even in the UK and indeed in Europe. Now, I think it is crucial to understand that and to understand the motivations of the actors and to find out where this misinformation comes from. What think tank is behind this? Oh, it's the same people who also deny climate change. That's valuable knowledge to have. And just to tell you a bit about what's behind vaccine hesitancy, it's by no means the only variable, but it is a very powerful variable. What is behind vaccine hesitancy very often is populist politics. This graph shows the vote share for populist parties along the x-axis and the vaccine hesitancy score on the y-axis. And you can see there's a massive relationship. The more people vote for populist parties, the more likely they are to be vaccine hesitant. And that is not an isolated finding. In fact, there is now a surprisingly, a growing and by now surprisingly large body of findings associating vaccine hesitancy with various indicators of the political right, not the left, which is very interesting in light of the fact that there's much media speculation that I've seen about journalists attributing hesitancy to the political left. Well, no, in the data, it just simply doesn't show up over and over and over again. It tends to be people on the right. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everybody on the right is vaccine hesitant. However, there's enough of a pattern here to give you this, which are data from as recently as April 16th, that was 5 days ago, What I'm showing you here are two graphs. The one on the left is plotting the vote share for Trump. The more red, the more Trump versus Biden. The more blue on the left, the more Biden votes across different states. And on the y-axis, I'm plotting hesitancy based on survey data. And look at what's going on. The red states are much higher on that than the blue states, and the ones that are indeterminate, well, they're in the middle. It's another one of these striking regularities that relates politics that really should have nothing to do with vaccinations. But there is a connection, and in fact, we know why that is. I think that is very striking. On the left, we have hesitancy. On the right, we have the share of people already vaccinated. And again, you have the inverse relationship, as you would expect. The more Trump voters, the fewer vaccinations have been administered. Very strong statistical regularity. What can you do about that? Well, first of all, it's important to understand. And then secondly, you have to have culturally appropriate messengers. And in the United States, that means you have to differentiate between Democrats and Republicans. And in other countries, including the UK, it means you have to differentiate between different ethnic groups and have different communicators for different ethnic groups, as indeed we do here in Bristol. And that's been just over 20 minutes. So I'll thank you for your attention. And I hope that we can now have a lively Q&A. And I think I'll hand over to Philipp to manage that for starters, since I've talked for the last 20 minutes. And I'll stop sharing the screen so we can see each other a little better. Over to you, Philipp.
Thank you so much, Steve, for this great talk. I think it gave an impressive overview of what's out there and what the issues and tasks are that we need to face and tackle if we talk about an infodemic and all the problems that are out there. I just want to encourage everyone who's participating to just drop questions in the chat. I only have one now in the chat, and I will read that out loud in a minute, but just that you can drop a question whenever you like. And it can even be unrelated to the content of the talk. It can be related to vaccine hesitancy in general or misinformation. The first question that we received is there a study or statistic about MDs, medical doctors, sharing and producing disinformation? So me personally, and Steve, just correct me if you know a specific study. I don't know of a specific study that shows that there are doctors out there who spread willingly misinformation. I know that whenever we drop questionnaires about vaccine hesitancy and also about whether people believe in misinformation related to vaccination, that also medical doctors are prone to believe in some very, very weird stuff. They are generally very good at identifying fake from facts when it comes down to medical aspects and also about vaccination. But still, there are a lot of healthcare workers out there who still believe in misinformation. And actually, me and Steve, we are trying to tackle that in a new European international project. That's actually also the reason why the both of us are here together. And we try to find ways of how we can deal with misinformation related to vaccination in healthcare workers and help them identify it in their own dialogue style, but also to mitigate it when they talk to patients. So that is actually a very interesting and important issue. The other thing about having experts out there spreading disinformation, if there are people out there who, for example, hand out fake vaccination certificates and stuff, they won't tell you. That's one of the reasons why it is also difficult to detect. Steve, do you know of any specific study that highlights of misinformation among physicians?
No, I don't know of any specific study, but I do know that, I mean, as always, you get the occasional person who's a physician who will spread misinformation. In fact, the guy who launched one of these big conspiracy videos on YouTube was a doctor. Now, if you check him out, then it turns out he's suspended in California and is not allowed to talk to patients at the moment because he's got a record of, just dodgy behavior. So yeah, you will find individuals out there. And of course, this is the same in climate denial. There will be the occasional scientist who on paper sounds like they know something about climate change, who will say, oh, it's all rubbish, you don't have to worry about it. And then when you check them out, they all kind of fall apart because their credentials aren't what they seem to be. So individual instances do exist, but I don't think it's pervasive, and I haven't seen a study on it.
Right. The next question that we received is also a very good one. Does this mean, which refers to Steve's talk, that the key to combating the infodemic does not seem to be to produce more information, but to solve the political, social, and environmental factors that make disinformation easily spread? So from my point of view, this is also a question that relates to the ancient knowledge deficit model. So the belief that we can tackle misinformation by just providing facts. And that actually is only one step in trying to reduce the impact of misinformation. First, of course, we do need facts, and there is no way around it. So spreading facts is a good thing and very important to do. It also helps to debunk misinformation if we have the core facts at hand in a short and understandable way, and we can actually then produce more and sound bites about facts. So that's important. That's one part. But it does not help if we want to get rid of myth or misinformation that is already in the head of the people, that sticks with people to just provide simple facts, because then we ignore the cognitive architecture and also the social environment of individuals. We are influenced by many things, like friends in our social environments, by authority persons, and also by our own cognitive biases that were also presented by Stephen's talk. So it doesn't help to just write down a sentence and hope that everyone who reads that sentence will just nod their head and accept it. So we need to do something else. We need, for example, to tailor messages to specific target groups. What is the need of a specific group, and what kind of message do we need to actually reach out to that specific group? And one aspect of this tailoring of information is just to use and identify the actual channel that can be used to reach out to that group. So for example, if you have elderly who are vaccine hesitant, producing WhatsApp games will not help, because they won't use their mobile phone, go online and play a little game. So you need to identify the media channels that are important to reach out to that group. But you also need to understand what kind of hesitancy you are actually talking about when you try to address specific kinds of misinformation. What kind of myth or misinformation is it that you try to address? And we can only understand that if we have a first phase of identifying what the people actually believe before we target them with specific interventions. And in many programs, this first step is actually ignored, and we just produce interventions, or we produce facts, or as a health authority, we just think that putting out facts on a web page will help. Well, the bad news is it won't. So the next question is, doesn't debunking or fact-checking skeptics or hesitants in a public setting simply cause them to double down on their existing beliefs? I think that is a very good question related to the debunking handbook, and I might hand over to the first author of that book.
Sure. No, it's a great question. I think, well, yes, it is very important to divide your audience, or at least to know who you're talking to, because different groups of audiences are receptive to different messages. Now, what we find by and large is that a very large number of people is quite receptive to corrective messages when it comes to vaccines, but also to other arenas. I mean, Philipp has shown that in a recent paper. that you can correct people. There's a mountain of evidence suggesting that, yes, you can correct people, subject to the stickiness proviso that I mentioned at the beginning, which is that sometimes they act as though they haven't been corrected. But you can get them to update their factual beliefs, at least to some extent, to some point. Now, I'm very carefully saying that's a large share of people. It's not everybody, because there are some people to whom a conspiracy theory has become a part of their identity. And there's a very strong association in the data between conspiratorial thinking and anti-vaccine attitudes. In case there are some geeks who like numbers, I can tell you it's about 25% of the variance. What that means is it's big. That's the translation of 25% of the variance. And conspiracy theories or theorists, some of them are notorious for being very difficult to debunk. So I totally appreciate that there are some people for whom it's part of their identity. They may double down on their attitudes. Now, my personal advice is whenever possible, let's not spend too much effort on those particular people because they're not reachable. Your effort is better spent talking to the other 90% or 80% of people who are not down the rabbit hole, because they are receptive. So that is what I would say to that. Now, generally, overall, people do not double down when you correct them. It is a small number of people who sometimes do, but by and large, not everybody. So it's quite nuanced, but I'm happy to say that as an average statement.
Thank you, Steve. I think that was very clear. There is a next question directly related to your content about inoculation. I will skip that for now because Mr. Rob Butler repeated that same question again later. So I would just use Claire French's question first, then I can answer that, and then we will just read out Rob Butler's question. So Claire is asking, thank you for a really interesting presentation. What do you think are the key gaps in knowledge with regards to both understanding reasons for vaccine hesitancy and also developing effective strategies for overcoming it? So that's quite a broad question. I think this question is related to practitioners and scientists on what they can do as a next step to produce better knowledge about vaccine hesitancy and effective interventions. Well, one of the things that we as scientists and practitioners need to do is to work together on the existing protocols and theories that we have and put them into practice to collect more data about whether they actually work or not. We are at a stage in research now where we have developed quite good ways of measuring vaccine hesitancy, different ways, and several ones for several specific cultural backgrounds and so on. And we also have an understanding of what kind of intervention should work in a specific group that shows a specific hesitancy value. So we do know that, but we don't have enough empirical data to actually prove and show how effective this is in comparison to the general approaches of just throwing stuff out. So what we need to do now is actually translate our hesitancy measurement scales and also our interventions into something that can be used by practitioners and at the same time is evaluated by scientists. At the moment, it more seems like there are practitioners and interventions that are put out there, and there are scientists who evaluate stuff. But we need to bring that together to kind of have an understanding of effect size of intervention and how we can identify moderators that make that even more effective in specific groups or identify where it is not effective. So that kind of step is, from my perspective, what we need to do next. Okay, Steve is agreeing, that's a good sign. I will ask Rob Butler's question now to you, Steve. Rob is asking, Inoculation needs us to be predictive. What about the next generation of adolescents, adults, parents? Leveraging educational programs to help next generation learn how to be source data skeptical, changing the way they consume and internalize information, and shifting out misinformation more intuitively. Are there examples of where we have successfully done this using school programs and education? We manage this partially with smoking and alcohol dangers and risk aversion, but do we have examples where this is done for vaccine misinformation?
Great question, Rob. And it's a multi-component question, so not surprisingly, it has a multi-component answer. First of all, generally, when we're talking about critical thinking and protecting people against misinformation in younger people against that, there are some helpful precedents out there. One example I can cite is Finland, where discerning misinformation or dealing with it, identifying it and resisting it is part of the curriculum for school children. And there's no escaping that. Everybody in Finland is when they're 10 or 12, they learn that. It's part of the curriculum. From all I've seen, that's highly successful. So that's one precedent. The other precedent is, for example, work by Sam Weinberg at Stanford, who has developed a teaching package. It only takes about an hour or so to administer, that teaches high school students to learn how to sift trustworthy from less trustworthy information. And the key insight of that project and that program is called lateral reading. Now, what's lateral reading? Well, what most people do when they're trying to figure out whether to trust a website is that they stare at the website and they kind of try and look at it, and they look here and there and they click on a photo and who are we and about us and all that kind of stuff. And they're trapped on the site to understand what it's about. Now, a lateral reading is the opposite. And that's what fact checkers do, it turns out. And what that means is that you don't spend any time looking at that website at all. What you do instead is to open a bunch of other tabs in your browser, and you then start Googling that website. And you then find other sources you know to be trustworthy, like the New York Times. They're doing okay most of the time. Or Snopes, or fact check, Full Fact, or misinformation detection sites, all of these things. And you see if they have anything to say about that particular website that you're interested in. Now, if you do that, then you can usually find out within minutes what you're dealing with, because somebody will have detected, oh, hang on, that website is funded by the fossil fuel industry, and guess what? It tells you that climate change is a hoax. Right. Well, maybe I shouldn't be too swayed by that information then. And you can teach kids that. They love it. They become so much better at it. And they then think it's an entertaining game to discover whether they can trust a website, which is precisely where you want them. So there are some precedents for that to do this. The specific question about vaccination, it's an excellent idea, and the answer is no, not at the top of my head. I don't recall anything about vaccination with school kids. I don't know. I may be wrong. So, but there's one other comment I want to make, because implicit in the question is the focus on education. And yes, of course, we need to educate people. I would never knock education. I'm an educator, so I better believe in it. However, there's a bigger political component to this, yet again. Can't escape the politics. And the political component is that at the moment, most of the misinformation people encounter is on social media, and it is spread and permitted to be there by social media platforms. And we have to understand the mechanism by which that dissemination takes place. And we have to have a conversation about responsibility of the platforms in getting this under control, because it turns out that on YouTube, for example, the recommender system can or has been implicated in leading people to misinformation, certainly about climate change, also radical Islamophobic information, and so on and so on. So it's not the case that people are consciously choosing to be exposed to misinformation. On YouTube, with the autoplay feature, where the next video comes on, whether you like it or not, people can actually be presented with things they might not necessarily have chosen to see, and it can be very discomforting information. I think that's a really important aspect of all this to keep in mind. And well, if we have more time, if people want to know later, I can talk more about the platforms and how that relates to COVID. For now, what I'm going to do is I promise it's the last one, pop another link into the chat of another report I didn't mention that I was involved in for the European Commission that is involved examining the whole relationship between technology and democracy. And that is a critical background to understand because it's not just education. We also got to have a conversation about the responsibility of the platforms.
Thank you, Steve. Alicia added to this question also a comment. We in Venezuela have designed an educational campaign from the Academy of Physical, Mathematical and Natural Sciences, whose motto is Health Hazard Science, with the aim of educating and informing from science to achieve a better management of the pandemic and promote prevention from the appropriate spaces of rationality. We hope to be successful. So there is more stuff going on that might be interesting for the future. Now we have more questions here. Daniela is asking a very long question. She starts with, I have a question regarding the COVID-19 vaccines. Every time there are some important side effects during the vaccine administration, the vaccination is stopped. This is as if for every plane crash, you would stop all traffic in the whole world and all the aircraft would be on the ground. It does not seem reasonable, especially if you don't necessarily have proof of any link of the two. Your question is longer than that, but I think it covers what I read out loud. It covers what you were trying to ask. It would be great if Adam would be here, but unfortunately he couldn't make it to answer that question. Nevertheless, we do know that this processes of evaluating safety and effectiveness of vaccines is a specific task of these special groups that make recommendations of whether specific vaccines can be recommended to the public based on public health impacts or not. So they do not think in the first stage of this process about whether this creates trust or distrust or how to communicate vaccination best. The step of these expert groups is to evaluate whether this is a good thing or not, whether to recommend or not. So when new data comes in and they are not sure anymore, they need to update that process. And there is a nice example from the government of Australia. I'm just dropping that link here. A visualization of the risks and benefits of AstraZeneca, where you can see that actually things do change in relation to exposure to the disease and in relation to your age. So in the first phase of COVID-19, it was actually looking at the graphs of that document that I just sent around, it was actually not such a good idea to get vaccinated if you are below the age of 50 with AstraZeneca, but now with higher exposure, it actually does make sense. So it's not only about whether vaccines do have side effects, but also what kind of exposure are we talking about? And all these factors need to be kind of modeled into the simulations that these experts group try to do to then come up with a recommendation. And so sometimes they do decide, well, let's just stop and see whether our models still fit.
Yeah. Great response, Philipp. Can I just add something to that? Because it's a fascinating issue and something I've been following for the last few weeks or months, especially with AstraZeneca. and especially the difference between the UK approach and the European approach. And it is, yeah, it's a fascinating cultural difference, and I know pretty much where it's coming from. And the answer is that Europeans are precautionary. They're risk averse, far more so than the British and Americans. You know, I mean, Americans, and they're risk takers. And so even though they don't particularly like taking great risks, they're at least happy to consider the trade-off between different risks. Whereas the Europeans are much more focused on a precaution arising out of a particular risk without necessarily comparing it to the risk of the disease, which is, you know, a very fundamentally different approach. I'm oversimplifying this. It's a little more nuanced, but I think there is a basic, you know, truth in that. Now, what is very interesting also is specifically when it comes to the AstraZeneca vaccine, two things. Number one, the Europeans discovered that tiny signal in the data at a time when the UK had vaccinated a hell of a lot more people and had not detected it. And it was weeks later, I've got the dates written down somewhere, before the UK health authority said, oh yeah, by the way, there's 79 cases that went in the UK retroactively, but they hadn't discovered that signal. And I think the reason for that is that if you look at in the population level, the epidemiology was never the vaccine. It is just that specific constellation of factors that is so rare that the Europeans discovered that because they only focused on that. So there's a whole very interesting backstory to this, and I would not come down on one side or the other as being necessarily superior, because both approaches have drawbacks, and there's a huge literature on that, and I don't have time to get into that. But there's one other thing to say, and that is the analogy with airplanes is very good, because at first glance, yes, what we're doing now with AstraZeneca is kind of like grounding the entire fleet once there has been a crash. Well, actually, we have done that. It's called the 737 MAX or whatever it was, the Boeing airliner. After 2 crashes, that was grounded because it was a rare side effect that was due to something related to that particular aircraft. And so, in fact, we do that with airplanes. And in the same way, it's a great analogy, actually. But what I was also going to say is that a lot of this isn't a matter of numbers and trade-offs alone. Risk is always something that is psychological. You cannot have a risk decision or risk judgment without the psychology of people perceiving the risk. So depending on who you're dealing with, the right decision, quote unquote, may be very different. In a population such as, let's say France, vaccine hesitancy is greater than in the UK. In that country, you probably want to stop vaccinating the moment there is a side effect, because you really don't want people to become more hesitant. And so it might make a hell of a lot of sense for the French to stop vaccinating, while at the same time the British can continue because the British are more tolerant to risk. So the psychology of the people involved has to be taken into account. And as I mentioned earlier, and now maybe is the time to expand on that a little, there are now data suggesting that in Denmark, at least, where the study was done, stopping the vaccinations with AstraZeneca did not increase hesitancy overall. It made AstraZeneca look bad, yeah, sure. But the other vaccines were protected against that. People were smart enough, or whatever you want to call it, to realize it's one vaccine, but not the others. And there's other data by Michael Bang-Petersen at the University of Aarhus, also in Denmark, who has found that being careful is actually, in the long run, enhancing people's trust in the system. And so stopping vaccinations on the basis of an incredibly rare side effect may appear an exaggerated response. And I have a lot of sympathy for people who say that. But if you then consider the long-term effects on public opinion about vaccinations and their health system, it may be just the right thing to do in certain cultural contexts, but not elsewhere.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that additional, also more psychological perspective to that question. Simon was also asking a question directly related to one of your slides, I guess, regarding the graphs with voting behavior and vaccine hesitancy. And also in a wider sense, what's your thinking about potential root causes or underlying variables and how we respond to those? I'm not very sure which kind of slide he was referring to, but you probably do know, Steve.
Well, probably the one relating populism to hesitancy, or the other one relating Trump voting to hesitancy, which is the same thing. Really. Yeah, excellent question. Root causes. Okay. Well, first of all, populism is defined as an ideology that's dividing a society into the elite that is corrupt and the virtuous people that are pure and just wonderful. And that's it. That's all populism is. There really is nothing else to it. Now, depending on where you, and it's a completely artificial construction, of course, you know, I mean, society is much more complex than that, but populists boil it down to that antagonism. Now, depending on where you put that dividing line, if scientists are considered to be part of the elite, well, then there's your answer. Then in a populist logic, that means they can't be trusted. And that is precisely what is happening in these graphs, I think, because a populist isn't going to be swayed by evidence anyway. I mean, you know, evidence is an establishment concept. So is truth. That's why populists can get away with lying and on an industrial scale, because they have redefined honesty to be authenticity rather than accuracy. And science goes out the window, evidence goes out the window. You know, you just do it all based on feeling or nationalism or whatever. So that's one root cause, if you want. The other one is that, of course, vaccinations always come with baggage, and the baggage is number one, the nanny state, because you may mandate certain vaccinations for children because to protect public health, and the other attribute of that is, you know, implicit in vaccination is also the idea of a common good, because herd immunity is achieved if enough people are vaccinated. And then the people who benefit from the herd immunity are those, ideally, who for other health-related reasons cannot get vaccinated. So a vaccination means I'm doing my part to keep other people alive, not just myself. And that whole common good approach can be ideologically problematic to libertarians, just like climate change is, which is another common goods problem. And of course, the government interference in you know, potential government interference in people's right to not vaccinate their children. That's why in the United States, at least, a lot of opposition to vaccinations is among libertarians and right-wingers, because they do not want to be told that you must keep your kids alive. They don't want the government to tell them that. So I think that explains it perhaps enough.
Thank you so much, Steve. I also want to add to that vaccination as an issue before COVID-19 actually is not something on the hierarchy of decisions and attitudes of people that is way up there. So if someone wakes up in the morning, the first thing that comes to mind is not, should I get vaccinated or not? But one of the first things is whether we align with our social environment and whether we actually align with our tribe in our political orientation, which is part of that. So social life and whether we are aligning with the beliefs of the ones that we think are important is on the hierarchy of decisions way more up than deciding whether I want to get vaccinated or not. So I can easily sell that one, the one belief about vaccination, if I can buy into acceptance within my social group. And that is something that might change with COVID-19 vaccination, because even though this is a crisis, it is also a chance about educating people about the importance of prevention measures. All right, I think we have time for one last question, but I think we actually covered most of them. Is there one final question you would like to ask?
I can't see anything that we haven't dealt with, I think. Oh, there's one from Alicia about, doesn't this mean that we should solve the political, social, and environmental factors that make disinformation easily spread? Yes, it does mean that. Please do. Good luck.
That is a very nice key message, I think, for the end. Thank you so much, everyone, for the very interesting questions and the very good discussion that we had. And of course, we thank Steve very much for his great talk.
Thank you. And great questions. I always enjoy them. I mean, it's great fun to have a good interactive Q&A. And thank you, Philipp, for handling a lot of them and also the moderation. That was great stuff.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and with that, I'll sign off and I'll leave you to it. Take care. Bye.